to all you fine people. It's wonderful to see everybody here today for Brown. So is it not on? It's on. Everybody's just having such a good time, which is a good thing. So Ken, is it on and you can hear me, right? Right? Okay. So as I was saying, welcome to everybody to Brown Bag Lunch today. It's wonderful to see you all here. We have a visitor today from Arizona. Donna Keeney is here. And she, as you know, Donna lived here for a long time, and she's my harness racing go-to expert. And so she knows all about it, and I'm always so happy to see her, so I'm glad you came back. Thank you very much. That is good. We have one birthday today. Well, we have two birthdays today. We have one birthday card going around for Ray Scott, who's our volunteer that lives in Wisconsin and comes all the way over here just to volunteer. And we appreciate him. And happy birthday.
Thank you.
I can't say it. I want you to know I have a flooded basement today, and I'm not even really here. Gloria, thank you. Gloria, I'm sorry. Don't worry to say happy birthday. Gloria Jorgensen. I'm sorry. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Gloria. Happy birthday to you. We're glad you're here. All right, going around with the cards is the fair schedule. And when it gets to you, if you would look at it carefully and see if, please, you could volunteer half a day, I think it's only 3 or 4 hours, at the museum on the fairgrounds. And that just gives us the ability to keep the museum open for all the people who come to the fair. And thanks to Dan Davidson, they get to go through the museum for free. And so that's, we feel, our way to give back to the fair and the fairgrounds. But we can't do it without volunteers. And so hopefully you'll find a place on that schedule to sign up. If you do sign up, we will have a fair pass for you, so it will not cost you anything to come to the fair that day. So there's good in all things. So I hope that you will come and help us. Also, tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock here will be a meeting of muster on the Maquoketa as we try to get geared up for our Civil War reenactment that will be coming in September. And if you have any desire to help with that, we would certainly love to have you. We certainly need a lot of volunteers for that. We'd like to ask everybody to turn off their cell phones so they don't ring in the middle of our YouTube video. And usually it's mine who rings, but you know, I try. Brown Bag Lunch next week is going to be a surprise. I'm just waiting for somebody to volunteer. I see lots of capable people here, and we always say that there's a Brown Bag Lunch in each one of you. So I'm just waiting for that. Okay, today we are going to talk about, as you can see, we're going to talk about sawmills and lumber yards. And it's kind of been, you know, it's whatever's happening around the museum is what you hear about. If we're doing research for somebody on a topic, then that's probably what you hear about for Brown Bag Lunch. But we just got some really wonderful information from Ted Mays, who was a big lumberyard guy, as you know, and most of you know Ted. And so we're going to talk a little bit about sawmills and lumberyards and just, you know, kind of how important they were. And we're just going to kind of start at the beginning. So, you know, as civilization moved westward and Iowa was being settled, some of the very first business ventures in every area were always sawmills. And that stands to reason because in order to build up an area, lumber was really necessary. In Jackson County, one of the reasons Jackson County was such a wonderful area to people coming in is because we had rich soil, we had heavily forested areas, we had many springs and streams, so there was a lot of water available. It was just a wonderful place for people to come, and settlers were just coming in droves And of course, at first, they built log cabins. And they built log cabins because, at first, they weren't sawmills, so that they could have sawn lumber and build a very nice frame house. So we know that the first settlers came into Bellevue in 1833, and so they kind of had a head start. They could put claims on land way before we could in this part of the county. Things didn't really start getting going here until 1837. And I think that was the year that a company in Galena, across the river, sent a man by the name of Joseph Henry here. And he was supposed to establish a sawmill on the South Fork of the Maquoketa, which would pretty much be the first one that was here. And he made a valiant attempt. He tried. But everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and it was a failure. So in 1838, J. Goodnow and Lyman Bates arrived from New York. And though they were here and there was a post office established, there really was no thought of a town here at first, because after all, there was Bridgeport, there was a place called North Maquoketa, and several others. So nobody thought that there was going to be a Maquoketa on this spot. But a remarkable man came along, and his name was David Sears. And together with a man named, I have lots of troubles today. So, a remarkable man by the name of David Sears came with a man named Doolittle from Kentucky, and they platted the town of Lowell. And the town of Lowell was just a mile north of the corner of Main and Platte Street, right where the river is. And the reason we're kind of talking about him first today is because I want you to see how he made his fortune. He was an extremely wealthy man. He made his fortune as he worked his way westward. And when he was in Pennsylvania, he purchased 1,000 acres of virgin timber, and he built a sawmill. And he did a booming business. He rafted logs down the Allegheny River to Pittsburgh and other flourishing towns, and he just made money hands over foot. And it was at this sawmill, the story goes, that his son George, who was working for him, young man, attempted to brush sawdust from a big saw blade and cut his hand off. According to the history books, entirely off. And his mother sewed back together his mangled flesh, and he was soon able to do hard labor again. It's just kind of hard, but that's in several history books. Kind of hard to see how that could have happened, but it certainly was a miracle. Well, in 1845, David was in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he started 2 mercantile stores, but he was an adventurer, and he kind of became tired of them, so he decided to venture westward. So he came westward, he got to Chicago, and like we've heard so often, he just considered Chicago a squalid and a muddy town. It had not much to offer back then, and so he passed on. And he heard about the wonderful land to the west, and he arrived at the site of Maquoketa in the spring of 1845. And he saw again great opportunity. There was the river, and there was heavy timber and fertile lands that were being cleared for crops, and floods of settlers coming through almost daily. So, though this plat is a little later, at least it shows you where the North Fork and the South Fork came together. That's where the town of Lowell was, just a mile north of Maquoketa. Just kind of shows you where things were. And as we said, he had already amassed a fortune. But with that money, he acquired several hundred acres of land where the Beaton and the Seeberger farms were located, as well as a large tract of land east of the river. And I just wanted to tell you that that land that we're talking about is where the Mayberry farms ended up. Is that correct? I think so. Maybe not. A little further north, okay. But Barb, there is a connection, a relation, and Barb brought her book today. So anybody who has interest in that, Barb has some really wonderful information that she would share with you.
But not of Sears, of Miller.
Right, yeah. Of Miller. Okay, and so that's true. It was Miller. Okay, so So David Sears then, you know, everybody came first without their wife and their kids. So he went back for his wife and his children, 6 children. He loaded all of his household goods, including a red and blue top buggy on a steamship. And just like the Swigerts who came in 1854, he came down the Ohio and up the Mississippi, and he took teams and wagons to bring his stuff to this area. And they arrived, and they spent 3 days with J. Goodnow in his log cabin hotel before they could move into a house. And the house that they moved into was located right where our post office stands today, okay? The story is told that because his family, he had so much money, and his family lived in luxury in Ohio, when they got here and they saw what things were like, the children all burst into tears, because rushing out to greet them, barefoot and very dirty with ragged trousers and a stained blue hickory shirt, was J. Goodnow. And they just couldn't help but think of what they gave up to come here and live in on the frontier, okay? So the first thing that David did was he built a dam, because you had to have a dam before you could have any kind of a mill. And this is afterwards. This is the site of the dam. He began construction of a log and brush dam across the river, where we would think of the old 61 bridge crossing the river. That's where it was. There were flumes on each end, and we'll go back one. There were flumes on each end for water wheels, and he built a sawmill, a large sawmill on the south side, and a 3-story grist mill on the north side. And as soon as the machinery for the mills arrived from Cincinnati, and again they had to come by boat and by ox cart, they were operational. As soon as they were operational, he was in business. He built a large brick home, number of small cottages, and a covered bridge, which travelers were charged a small fee for him to cross. So the woolen mill, a little later, a woolen mill was added to this, and a prosperous little village grew around the mills, and it was incorporated and called the Lowell Merchant Mills. So as the settlers increased in number, Mr. Sears found it necessary to add new equipment all the time so that he could meet the demands. He built a substantial frame building over his sawmill, and he added a large wooden turning lathe and other woodworking machinery to fill the need for bedposts and table legs and things like that. Something that we have at the museum, that I hope you'll pay attention to, we kind of got by accident, but it's a wonderful thing. You know, it made quite a change from just crude logs to make your furniture out of, to have walnut and maple spindle beds and things like that. The Sears family, and you see here Anna Hanson Sears, and she and her husband lived in a house that was right next to the Carson Funeral Home. And that house came down a few years ago, and they had an auction. And it was the kind of auction where antique collectors and people like that, professional people, came in. It was a tag sale, for instance. And they came in and they bid on all the different pieces of furniture and things like that. After they were gone, the Historical Society was allowed to come in. We got to go through the house, and we got to take whatever was left that we wanted that didn't have a tag on it. Well, back under a staircase, there was this single bed, like a single bed, and it was all spindles, and it was a little on the crude side, but it was quite beautiful. Nobody wanted it but us, because we knew what it was, because of this article that was in the newspaper about Anna. And she talked about how her father-in-law, David Sears, her husband's grandfather, David Sears, brought this turning mill to Lowell and began to make this old furniture. And so we knew from that that this was one of the first beds that was made in Lowell, one of the first more modern beds. And so we're really happy to have that at the museum, and I hope when you're there volunteering for the fair, right, you will go upstairs and you will take a look at that. at that bed, because it's a very neat thing for us to have. And if it hadn't been for this article, we probably wouldn't have realized what it was either. So, as things went along, David Sears saw a need to replace spinning wheels. Everybody was still making their blankets and their clothing and etc. in spinning wheels in their houses. So he formed a partnership with Thomas Wright, who had been here for some time, and they added a woolen mill to the Lowell mills so that they could make woolen goods. And the building was placed at one end of the sawmill, which was again on the south side, and it contained a lot of looms and other necessary equipment to make these things. Well, we don't have, there are no pictures of all of this, but on February 10th of 1855, this all changed and came to an end because a disastrous fire broke out in the sawmill building. It was underneath the turning lathe that we had just talked about and all the sawdust, etc. And it spread to the woolen mill, which was then completely destroyed. Only a very few bolts of cloth were left. Everything else was gone. A few weeks later, as if that wasn't enough, a few weeks later, disaster struck again. Melting snow and hard rains caused a flood that tore a new channel through the fine sand to the east. And the course of the Maquoketa River changed, leaving the grist mill, leaving everything high and dry. So David Sears, there was nothing left of Lowell, nothing that would work. But through all of this, David Sears had built stores in Maquoketa, and he was affiliated with Pierce Mitchell, and they had wonderful stores that were very successful. And so he was able to survive. Remember, all this is because of his lumber business. So he had joined with other businessmen, and he had constructed the Union Block in downtown Maquoketa by then, and in partnership with his sons Benjamin, William, and Sendall, he was proprietor of number 13 Excelsior Block, and we always hear about the Excelsior Block. He sold groceries and other provisions and all kinds of things, and a manufacturer even of fur goods. Well, once more, because of the wealth he brought with him from his sawmills, he owned several thousands of acres of land in Jones and Jackson counties. And he no longer had his mills, but he bought and sold horses. He had oxen, cattle, and hogs, grain, and land claims. And at one time, we know that he closed a deal to furnish 100 yoke of oxen, broke to work, to a place in northern Iowa. And again, all because of his lumber mills. They were so important back then. So what J.W. Ellis of our Ellis history books had to say about him was that in the Annals of Jackson County, he talked about Lowell, and he said Lowell was quite a thriving business back in the days. It was considered so valuable that the lots were small. We're going to go back to that picture. See how small the lots are? They were only 25-foot fronts, and they had hoped to sell hundreds and hundreds of these lots and make a lot of money. But one thing, and it talked about the mansion that he built, the brick mansion, and J.W. Ellis said that he had always heard that Ben Sears, one of his sons, was inventing a wonderful wagon that when completed would run by steam on any kind of road and would revolutionize the mode of travel and do away largely with the demand for horses. So Sears' son, Ben, was inventing an automobile, right? So J.W. Ellis talks about how hard he worked to get into that building and just to get a glimpse of this new invention that he was doing. And he was never able to do it, but there were a lot of rumors around about the invention. And he said that building stood until 1869 or 70 when it came crashing down. And I don't know what happened to the automobile, but he never got to see it at least. So anyway, back to David Sears. He's in our Hall of Fame. He was active in public affairs. He attended the Baptist church. He was a brilliant businessman, but had a little bad fortune among the good. He died in Maquoketa in 1870, but that was the year that the railroads came to Jackson County, right? And when the railroads came, everything changed again. It allowed for the transfer of material from the sawmills to the towns, right? And it was a good way to get other things to market. And in 1878, which is only 8 years, really 7 years after the railroad came, the 1878 Directory of Jackson County lists over 250 businesses in Maquoketa alone. Can you imagine that? 250 businesses in Maquoketa in 1878, and they included 3 lumber yards and 3 sawmills. Okay, so we're going to go back through these. So I just put in a couple of pictures of the old sawmills. It said 3 sawmills. We don't know what sawmills they were talking about because they didn't list them, but there was the Teeter Sawmill in Farmers Creek Township. And I just find these old pictures so fascinating. And every time I have an opportunity, I like to share them with you. Another sawmill is the Joseph Miller and Son Sawmill and Lumberyard. And it was in the area called Pine Valley in Brandon. But we have another picture just like this that was donated by somebody else that places it in Monmouth Township. So we'll ask Barbara Mayberry, who has her book with her about the Miller family.
Well, all I know, he was from Brandon Township.
Okay.
Eventually, after his first wife died, he and his second wife moved to Arkansas. Then he moved where a son was in Washington, and the son had a shingle business. And he died quite suddenly of a heart attack, but that is where Joseph Smith ended up out there in Washington.
All right. Joseph Miller, right? Okay, so I think that pretty much answers our question. It was in Brandon Township and not Monmouth Township. But just look at the lumber. Way back when, the lumber piled up at these sawmills and the trees, and I think, oh, that's probably smoke. I thought it was a string. It's probably smoke. Another sawmill that I know that you've heard about is the big sawmill at the Canton Dam on the Maquoketa River. You know, Canton back in this era was larger than Chicago. And that's hard for us to believe, but it was larger than Chicago. It had all kinds of mills. It had flour mills and sawmills and grist mills and woolen mills, and Canton really had everything going for it. The railroad didn't end up there, and that's kind of what happened. But I thought that this photograph was interesting because you see here log channels, sawmill log channels. I didn't know what that was, so I had to investigate. And so these were ways that they used when they cut the timber in the forest, and they had all these logs. They would channel them through here somehow into the river and float them down the river to get them where they needed to be. So these log channels were really, really important. And Canton had them. And pretty much all of them used this, a steam tractor, pretty much like our little case steam tractor over in the Pennygroth machine shed on the farm, on the fairgrounds. And when you're volunteering over there for the fair, you can stop in and see our steam engine because it's really quite remarkable. But they use these, they put a belt on them and power takeoff, and they use that to run their sawmills, this little machine, big machine. And so that is how they did it. Okay, so like I said, we tried to figure out what the 3 lumber yards in Maquoketa were in the 1878 directory. And the information from the Jackson Centennial Edition of 1838 leads us to believe that one of them must have been the Sutherland and Tubbs lumber yard. Do we know anything about that? Okay, the Sutherland and Tubbs lumber yard, which was opened about that time. And we found it near the south end of Maquoketa. And this is the northwestern depot. South end of Maquoketa, pretty much where city limits is now, kind of right in that area at least, okay? In 1900, the Hand Fisher Lumber Yard was organized by William Hand and Fred Fisher, and so they purchased the Sutherland and Tubbs Yard to make their own Hand Fisher Lumber Company. And I bet some of you remember that. So this is a, Norma's not here today, is she? I was hoping Norma'd be here. So this is a photograph from our archive collection that, and I can tell by the number that this is a photograph that Norma put in. And she says that it's a fire scene in Maquoketa, maybe the Great Plains Lumber Yard, and I don't think there was one, located on East Platte Street. Well, then you wonder, okay, maybe it's the wrong, something's wrong with this. Maybe it's the wrong town, but not other towns in Iowa don't have a Platte Street with 2 T's, because our Platte Street is named after Platt Smith. And so that would be unusual for another town other than Dubuque, maybe to have a street by that name. And so when you look at the photographer, it says it's Mrs. E. Kingsley Smith, who was the photographer. Well, we know that George Kingsley was our photographer, but haven't heard of a Mrs. Kingsley Smith who was a photographer. So somehow I think that got all twisted up. But I think we did figure it out. So after taking over the lumber yard that was down by the Northwest Depot, the Hand-Fisher Lumber Company moved to East Platte Street. So they were across from the old Catholic Church on East Platte Street. And that's where the Lutheran Church is now. That must be where that was. Mr. Hand and Mr. Fisher died not too long after that. Fisher's son Harry had worked there since he was 17 years old, and he took over the lumber yard. And it was kind of interesting because Harry was also Maquoketa's fire chief for over 30 years, including 1933 when his lumber yard burned. And I think that this is a photo from our archives, and I think this is the Hand-Fisher, second Hand-Fisher Lumber Company, and it burned. And so we just need to fix all that. Probably few of us remember that lumber yard, but how many of you remember this lumber yard? Okay, this also is the Hand-Fisher Lumber Company. Do you remember this? It was so Harry Fisher rebuilt. He rebuilt again on East Platte Street, but down by the Milwaukee Depot. And remember, the Milwaukee Depot was right at the end of this street, right? And it was said to be one of the best lumber yards in eastern Iowa. It handled coal and anything in the building material line. And it talked about employees that were Fred Bradley and Reese Taylor and Fred Joyner. But I remember this lumber yard really well, because I'm really old. And this building right here is the back of my father's plumbing and heating store, right? And I remember this being there, behind that, up against the railroad tracks so that they could unload lumber right from the railroad car right into the lumber yard. And it was just a really neat place. So in front of this, you remember, was a grocery store. It was first the Wendell grocery store, and then the Russell Brothers grocery store with Roy Russell. It was a wonderful little store, so I spent a lot of time there. And so, but this was always there. So I wonder if anybody remembers this. I kind of remember that the owners to that were either named Kriebel or Krebs. And I haven't been able to find that. But this was there for quite a long time. And maybe the rest of the lumber yard was gone. We have a couple artifacts in the museum from this lumber yard. We have a nail apron that all lumber yards handed out their nail aprons, right? With Hand-Fisher on it. And we have a huge, huge chunk of coal upstairs in the main museum. And you can also look at that when you come to volunteer, right? It's right upstairs. And it's pretty amazing because, you know, children today don't know what coal look like. And so they see this huge piece of shiny black coal, and so it's fun to be able to talk to students about that hunk of coal that came from the Hand-Fisher Lumber Company. So we're still looking for a lot more information about this lumber company. But kind of what prompted this today was Ted Mays. Ted Mays is one of my very favorite people in Maquoketa. He just knows so many interesting, fascinating things. And he came in the other day and he brought us a history of the Green Bay Lumber Company that he was affiliated with. Okay, so I know that you remember the Green Bay Lumber Company, right? And I wonder if anybody here remembers Mavis McNerney. Anybody remember Mavis McNerney? Well, she called the museum a couple years ago. You know, a couple of years ago could be 5 or 10, you know. And she was looking for information about the Green Bay Lumber Company. And she told us that she was 84 years old, and she described herself as ADHD, saying that she kind of bounced off the walls. So as she was, it was taking her a while, but she was trying to compile a history about the Green Bay Lumber Company. And she was looking for information. Well, we got as much information together as we could, but when we gave her the list of who we thought the managers were, we didn't include her father. And she was very unhappy with us. But we tried. Okay. So, Ted Mays brought us this wonderful article, and he's talking about the beginning of the Green Bay Lumber Company. It happened in 1879 when a man by the name of E.C. Finkbein purchased a lumber company in Oldbolt, Iowa. Is that Oldbolt? Oldbolt, Iowa? His brother joined him, and together they started growing this business. So, according to this article, the story about how the Green Bay Lumber Company got its name came from an old German language newspaper published in Carroll, Iowa, which was right near where it began. And it said that an old man in Oldbolt was asked in a joking manner what the name of the new lumber yard should be. And he told them that he would give it some thought and he would have an answer for them the very next morning. And so the next morning he came in and he called attention to the fact that Mr. Finkbein had started one yard and that he was adding other yards. And he was beginning to spread all over the country. And so he had suggested that the name be the Green Bay Lumber Company. And that's from a passage in one of the Psalms of the Bible where it speaks of spreading himself like a green bay tree. So that's where Green Bay Lumber Company came from. And the article goes on to talk about how the land was sparsely settled, and the farmers were already experiencing the blessings of the really good soil, and they were making big improvements to their farms. And they said that towns and villages were growing up like mushrooms out of the ground. And so the new firm did a huge business providing wood for the growing towns. And they did create a statewide chain of lumber yards. I didn't really realize, I guess, that Green Bay was a chain of a lot of lumber yards. I had never really thought of that. But they always created lumber yards in towns along the railroads, of course, because that only makes sense. And he talked about the Milwaukee and the Northwestern and the Rock Island Line and the CB&O. And of course, Maquoketa had both the Northwestern and the Milwaukee. So Green Bay came to Maquoketa in 1895, and they purchased the lumber yard of the George T. Bradley Company. And then along came Henry Mitchell. So during the time that all this was happening and the lumberyard was starting here, a young man by the name of Henry Mitchell, and you see him right here, was a high school student, and he began working for the company. And in 1905, Henry became manager of the Maquoketa lumberyard, of the Green Bay lumberyard in Maquoketa. And he was the youngest man ever to manage a Green Bay lumberyard, according to this article. So, and I just have to tell you, this is Helen's family, and this is her grandfather, and Henry's brother, Pierce, is Helen's father. And her mother died at childbirth when he was born, so the mother's not in the picture, but you see Frank and his lovely family there. So you're going to hear more about Henry Mitchell. Okay.
Bonnie,
Yeah, please.
that should be Frank and Ida Mitchell family.
Oh,
One of the sisters.
one of the sisters. Thank you. Remind me to change that. So I sent in, you know, I do brown bag lunches in the middle of the night or the wee early hours of the morning. And I sent an email to Helen saying, help. I knew that probably wasn't right, but she wasn't awake at 2 in the morning. And so, okay, so now I know. I'm sorry, and I will fix that. Okay, so under Mitchell's watch, and remember he was the youngest ever to be a manager of a Green Bay lumber company. Under his watch, in 1919, Green Bay bought the Phoenix House. And I'm sure none of you remember the Phoenix House. That was long ago, but it was a big old hotel, and it was right across the street from where the lumberyard was. And this hotel had been in existence for 26 years, and it had kind of outlived its usefulness. So the new lumberyard, they bought this, and the new lumberyard was built there in 1921. And so that was really a great thing, and away went the Phoenix House. But it's kind of interesting because, you know, we talk about Beach and Bowers, the minstrels from Maquoketa that traveled the country in a railroad car and performed all their minstrel act all over the country. And then Tom Smith and Harry Smith, that lived right up on the hill here, that were the great circus performers. They're in this picture also. So it's a good picture, but no longer there. So I don't know why I put this in here, other than this is kind of an overview of that part of town, and right here where the arrow is where the Green Bay Lumber Company is, right? Okay, and right here are all the railroad tracks and things that were there during the time. And you can pick out a lot of other things there if you're really looking. This little house right here was a hotel through the time, and it's still standing right on the corner of East Platte and Dearborn. It's right on the corner, and it still stands there. I think this is Dearborn Street, and I think that this is Walnut Street, where I live somewhere over, somewhere over here. Anyway, it's just kind of interesting to put things in.
Can't you see the sale barn there too, honey?
Oh, thank you. Yes, where is it? I saw it the other day. At 2 this morning I saw it. So it's right here, right? Okay, thank you. I meant to say that. Anybody else see anything interesting? We don't know the date of this.
Do you know how far from there the roundabout was?
I don't.
Okay.
But it should have been.
Right along in there somewhere, wasn't
Yes,
it?
I think so too. Yeah. So really, it's a really interesting picture to just really, really study. Okay, so I guess the important thing to realize is they moved across the street, okay, because that's where the Phoenix was. They built this in 1921, and they had control of the land down Platte Street to the railroad station and the railroad tracks, and then north down this street so that they could get to the railroad yards and everything. So it was a wonderful place for a lumber yard. They had all of the advantages for sure. It was handy for unloading the lumber and the coal and all of the different things. So it was just quite the place. So this, we believe, is a photograph in front of the older Green Bay Lumber Company, right? And it lists the men, and in our database, because the blacksmiths from Zawingle were there, they surmised that maybe this was a Zawingle picture. But I think, knowing that this was Henry Mitchell, this is in front of the railroad station, or in front of the lumberyard station. So in an article about the new building in July of 1921, it was the second newspaper then was called the Excelsior Record. It stated this, and I just want to read you this. Manager Henry Mitchell doesn't seem any more stuck up over the big involvement than he ever is, but we wish to state something here that everybody already knows, and especially his employers, that Henry Mitchell is responsible in greater part than any other one factor for the success of this company in Maquoketa. He has a host of friends who know him as one of the most honorable, upright, and honest men in the entire community. And this to be coupled with the desire of the Green Bay people to work on the square with all of their customers. And he's made the company a company of permanency in Maquoketa and Jackson County. We rejoice with the company and Mr. Mitchell, with whom it is always a pleasure to transact business. So that's as the new building was being built. And it's always interesting how newspapers back in the day comment on things. So there's Henry Mitchell. He ran the company until 1929. And in 1929, he was made vice president and general manager of the whole Green Bay lumber companies, and they moved him to Des Moines. At that time, they had 50 different lumber yards, all of which were in Iowa. They only had businesses in Iowa. And then we go back to Ralph McNerney. And about 1938, he came from Mount Carroll to be the manager of the Maquoketa yard. And at that time, his employees were Victor Allen and Pauline Hoot. Those of you who remember Pauline, she was a sister to Gletha Barker, Gletha Winship. She was their bookkeeper, and Leo Heister and Charles Kozak and Ed Armstrong. And so they just had quite a good company going. Now, if I had had Ted's letter when this lady called, Mavis, I could have shared this with her, but I didn't know back then. So as it went along, Al Meyer came here in 1946, as we said. He died in 1962. And those of you, do any of you remember Al Meyer? He and his wife adopted a little girl named Anne, and she was in my class at school. Anne was crippled, and she walked with great difficulty, but she was such a sweet person. She was sweet and happy her whole life in spite of her affliction. And I was really happy. I wasn't here, but I was really happy when later in life she found the love of her life, and she was married and just had a great life, and she just passed away a few years ago. But because of Anne, I went to the Green Bay Lumber Company a lot of times. And so I got to know Al Meyer and her mother, and they were just fine people. So after Al Meyer died, Leroy Everhart and Charles Kozak became co-managers for a little while. And then in 1963, the company brought our friend Ted Mays here from Eagle Grove, Iowa. And he had started working for the Green Bay Lumber Company in 1950. And he worked in Carroll, Iowa, Battle Creek, Charter Oak, and Maquoketa. Then he had a small stint in the Army in the middle. And in 1963, he came back to Maquoketa and became the manager of the Green Bay Lumber Yard. But in 1968, Green Bay sold the entire company to United Building Centers of Winona, Minnesota, and the Green Bay Lumber Company ceased to exist. So the lumber company was still there, but under different names. So this is a picture of where it was, and you remember this building. That's as it looked this morning. As you drove down, the street. It wasn't 2 o'clock in the morning. It was a little later than that. As is driving down the street, but this was the old Green Bay Lumber Company. Does anybody know what's happening to this building now? Barb?
The Haleys are selling their house, and they have built an apartment in the back of that.
Really?
And I know a son owns the house right in back of it, but I suppose until they're gone, nothing's going to happen to it.
Okay, I do see workmen there from time to time, and something going on, but never did know what. But that's the Green Bay Lumber Company.
Their son Will actually owns the old sale barn property also.
Oh, really?
Will Haley.
Will Haley. Okay. All right. So we just have a couple more pictures that I put in here. So there was a fun article in the newspaper, April of 1968, where, so Green Bay was gone, and I don't know how it became a Maquoketa Lumber Company then. There's nothing that seems to tell us that. But Leo Heister evidently was a stockholder, and Ted Mays bought his interest out, and eventually Ted Mays became the owner of the Maquoketa Lumber Company, which he runs now with his son Mark, right? Okay. So, and we thank Ted for all of this information. And again this morning, there is a picture of the Maquoketa Lumber Company. And really, when you look back, they really have, you know, quite a nice supply of lumber. It goes all along here. Now, I do know that there was at one time the Brock Lumber Company that was down that way, just north of this, correct? So from the research that I could find, they always sold used lumber, is that right? Okay, and now Steve Moorhead is in that place, just to kind of put things into perspective. Brock's, yeah, Brock's Lumber Company. So it was just north of here. And where Brock's Lumber Company was where the CCC camps were back in the day. Okay, so I just wanted to show you, you know, there were lumber yards everywhere, and we don't have as much information about all of them as we would like, but this is a fascinating old picture of the lumber yard at the south end of Bellevue. And this is one of my favorites because of the narrow gauge railroad. You see the narrow gauge railroad, the locomotive right here, and it went right by the Spawn and Rose Lumber Company. So that was, again, back in the day, and there are definitely Spawn and Rose Lumber Companies around in this day and age. But it's just fun to look at everything that's going on. And this lady walking through the mud and on her way. So these old pictures are just fun and priceless. And this is probably what, 1916 or something like that. I'm not a very good judge of cars. And then the Harry Hurst of the Hurstville Lime Kilns people had a store in Monmouth, and evidently he had a lumber yard there in the late 30s or late 40s and early 50s. And so here's some of the lumber from the lumber yard, some photos of the lumber yard in Monmouth. So we would like a lot more information if anybody has it. If your family was involved in any of these lumber yards or sawmills or something like that, we certainly would like more information. I'm glad that Barb brought the information about the millers. And are there any questions? All right. So I thank you very much for listening, and see you next week.